All right, Chapter 10, the cardiovascular system and exercise. Objectives: list important functions of the cardiovascular system. Describe how to use the auscultatory method to measure blood pressure and give average values for systolic and diastolic blood pressure during rest and moderate aerobic exercise. Describe the blood pressure response during 1, resistance training or resistance exercise, 2, upper body exercise, and 3, exercise in the inverted position. State potential benefits of aerobic exercise for treating moderate hypertension. Identify intrinsic and extrinsic factors that regulate heart rate during rest and exercise. Identify the neural and local metabolic factors that regulate blood flow during rest and exercise. Compare average values of cardiac output during rest and maximal exercise for an endurance trained athlete and sedentary person. Explain 3 physiologic mechanisms that affect the heart's stroke volume. Describe the relationship between maximal cardiac output and maximal oxygen uptake among individuals of varied aerobic fitness levels. List the Mayo Clinic's 7 benefits of regular physical activity. So we have the cardiovascular system anatomy, which is the heart, arteries, capillaries, and veins. This is on page 286. The schematic view of the cardiovascular system indicating the heart and pulmonary and systemic vascular circuits. The red shading depicts the oxygen-rich arterial blood. Blue shading denotes the oxygenated venous blood. The situation reverses in the pulmonary circuit. Oxygenated blood returns to the heart and the right and left pulmonary veins. So the heart provides force to propel blood throughout the vascular circuit. A septum separates the left and right sides of the heart. Atrioventricular valves near the tricuspid between the right atrium and ventricle. The mitral valve or bicuspid valve between the left atrium and ventricle. Semilunar valves prevent regurgitation between the ventricular contractions. You have the heart here, and basically the blood, either the deoxygenated blood from the tissues comes up from the trunk and lower extremity into the inferior vena cava, or from the head, neck, and upper body into the superior vena cava, into the right atrium. The right atrium then goes, you have the tricuspid valve that goes through that into the right ventricle, and then up into the pulmonary artery to get oxygenated, where the blood, basically you have the alveoli in the lungs where the blood goes there and gets oxygenated, and also the CO2 gets expelled from the lungs and the breath out. Oxygen gets oxygenated, or the blood gets oxygenated, comes back into the up here into the right ventricle, and then goes to the bicuspid valve down to the left ventricle, then out the aorta into the body, so that it's the oxygen blood goes to back to the tissues. And that's really what it talks about here. The heart pumps. So functions of the chambers of the right heart: pump, receive deoxygenated blood returning from all parts of the body, pump blood to the lungs for aeration via the pulmonary circulation. Functions of the chambers of the left heart: pump, receive oxygenated blood from the lungs, pump blood through the thick-walled musculature or muscular aorta for distribution throughout the body via the systemic circulation. Arteries, so the high pressure tubing that conducts oxygen-rich blood to the tissues because of their thickness. No gaseous exchange takes place between the arterial blood and surrounding tissues. Blood pump from the left ventricle to the aorta circulates throughout the body via a network of arteries and arterioles. The arterioles are smaller arterial branches. Okay. So arterial walls contain circular layers of smooth muscle that either constrict or relax to regulate peripheral blood flow. Then you have capillaries, which are a network of microscopic blood vessels so thin they provide only enough room for blood cells to squeeze through a single file. Gases, nutrients, and waste products rapidly transfer across the thin porous capillary walls. Velocity progressively decreases as blood moves toward and into the capillaries, so the further away it goes from the heart. And capillaries sometimes break on your skin. You'll see a little capillary break where you have a little bit of blood, and then it can create a bruise as well. Veins, venules empty into the superior and inferior vena cava, which is what I showed on that heart. Superior from the head and neck, and the inferior from the trunk, legs, things like that. So these thin membranous flat blade valves, spaced in short intervals within the vein, permit one-way blood flow back to the heart. Venous system acts as an active blood reservoir to either retard or enhance blood flow to the systemic circulation. And you have the valves and veins that. So you have, sometimes you'll see people wear those socks that are the mechanical compression socks, because they may have comprised cardiovascular function. Drive long distances, or take frequent air flights. The stockings basically minimize the blood pooling to prevent the clots formation, because if the blood's flowing upward towards the heart, and if the valve, sometimes the blood can pool there and sit there if the valve closes. Well, the compression socks help mitigate that. And that's why during after physical activity, you should really do a cool down, because to reduce the pooling in the veins. Active cool down. That's so maybe like slow jogging or walking afterward. Like an active recovery helps speed their blood's removal of lactate, and also just the hydrostatic. You want to try to get that flow going upward. Okay. Blood pressure, you have so systolic blood pressure is the highest arterial pressure measured after left ventricular contraction. So with each left ventricular contraction, a surge of blood enters the aorta, distending the vessel and creating pressure within it. The aortic wall stretch and subsequent recoil propagates a wave through the entire arterial system. Pressure wave rarely appears as a pulse in the following areas: the superficial radial artery on the thumb side of the wrist, temporal artery on the side of the head at the temple, and the carotid artery adjacent to the trachea in healthy persons. Pulse rate equals heart rate in healthy persons. Okay, so you have, and then diastolic is the lowest arterial pressure measured during left ventricular relaxation. Blood pressure during exercise, you have rhythmic exercise. You have increased systolic pressure in the first few minutes and then levels off. Diastolic pressure remains relatively unchanged. Resistance exercise can increase blood pressure dramatically. Upper body exercise at a given percentage of VO2 max increases blood pressure substantially more in upper body compared to lower body exercise. And then recovery after about a sustained light to moderate intensity exercise, systolic pressure decreases below pre-exercise levels for up to 12 hours in normal hypertensive subjects. So if someone runs for a half hour, let's say, 12 hours after that, it can decrease the blood pressure below pre-exercise levels up to 12 hours. For in regards to systolic decreases, it can decrease if you do a 30-minute daily aerobic activity. It can decrease the millimeters of mercury of pressure up to 9 millimeters of mercury. Other lifestyle choices are listed on 291 that can decrease your blood pressure. Low sodium diet, things like that. Blood pressure during exercise. This just talks about how you have your at-rest systolic blood pressure and diastolic, and then you have your aerobic exercise. Your diastolic doesn't move very much at all, but your systolic blood pressure goes up. You see this on a graded exercise test, like a treadmill test. Is one of the things they do to see to actually look at cardiomyopathy, so to see whether or not there's issues with the ECG electrocardiograph, to see if there's any blockages or weakened heart, if the rhythm's off and things like that. So you see 2-arm curl heavy load, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and then they both go up during that. And the systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, they're even higher during the 2-leg press heavy load. One of the things with this is that you need to know that the systolic blood pressure raises during aerobic, but the diastolic doesn't move much. Heart's blood supply, coronary circulation. So the heart, it needs blood as well, okay? Oxygenated blood. So you have the right coronary artery supplies predominantly the right atrium and ventricle. Left coronary artery supplies the left atrium and ventricle and a small portion of the right ventricle. And that's just what this talks about. The left main coronary artery, anterior descending branch left coronary artery. But then you also see here, you see any of right coronary artery at top as well. But then you look at the obstructed artery, that's what causes a myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. All right, so at rest, the myocardium extracts 70 to 80% of the oxygen from the blood flowing in the coronary vessels. Because near maximal oxygen extraction occurs in the myocardium at rest, increases in the coronary blood flow provide primary means to meet myocardial oxygen demands at exercise. In vigorous exercise, coronary blood flow increases 4 to 6 times above resting level. Okay. All right. So what else here? Okay, so basically the blood flow increases a large amount from the during vigorous exercise. Okay, that's rate pressure product. That what we're talking about here is that you have provides a convenient estimate of myocardial workload. 3 important mechanical factors determine myocardial oxygen uptake: retention, development in the myocardium, myocardial contractility, heart rate. So your rate pressure product, which is the systolic blood pressure times heart rate. Studies of people with coronary heart disease link the RPP to the onset of angina or electrocardiographic abnormalities, which is ECG. So reductions in heart rate and SBP at specific levels of submaximal effort with endurance training, improved cardiac patients' physical activity capacity before angina onset from reduced myocardial oxygen requirement. Um, so what it says here is that really the RPP, which is the rate pressure product, equals the systolic blood pressure times heart rate. There's indirect evidence for training-induced improvements in myocardial oxygenation, perhaps from greater coronary vascularization or reduced obstruction, or a combination of both. So it's extremely important. Physical activity is extremely important with people who have cardiovascular issues because it actually, the rate pressure product increases, and so it causes training-induced improvements in myocardial oxygenation. Heart's energy supply. The myocardium relies almost exclusively on energy from aerobic reactions. Myocardial tissues contain the greatest mitochondrial concentration of all tissues, and that's not surprising because there's a need for oxygen, and oxygen is basically created in you have in the aerobic metabolism in regard as opposed to glycolysis was anaerobic that happens in the cytoplasm. In the mitochondria, that's when you have the oxygen, where there's a need for oxygen. It's an anaerobic reactions that are taking place there through the Krebs cycle. So then, because of that, that's why there's a high amount of mitochondria. Glucose, fatty acids, and lactate formed from glycolysis and skeletal muscle all provide the energy for myocardial functioning. So glucose, fatty acids, lactate. So lactate is produced from you have anaerobic metabolism, and then you have which is the anaerobic, the glycolysis or lactate metabolism basically happens where where there is no oxygen, and then further down the chain you have the cellular respiration, which takes place in where you have the highest degree of ATP production, and it comes from glucose, fatty acids, and lactate. In this instance, that provide the energy for the myocardial functioning. Heart rate regulation, intrinsic. So you have the sinoatrial node, SA node, spontaneous depolarization repolarizes to provide an innate stimulus to the heart. Then you have the atrioventricular node, delays the impulse about 0.1 seconds to provide sufficient time for the atria to contract to force the blood into the ventricles. And then you have the AV bundle or bundle of His, and then you have Purkinje fibers that speed the impulse rapidly through the ventricles. So this shows you here that the red arrows on the figure on the left denote the normal route of excitation and conduction of the cardiac impulse. The impulse originates at the SA node, travels to the AV node, then sprints throughout the ventricular mass. Time sequence and then you look at B, the picture on the left, figure on the right, excuse me, with the numbers. Basically, it's a time sequence in seconds for the electrical impulse transmission from the SA node through the myocardium. Okay. So remember, SA node, innate stimulus to the heart. Okay. It's like the pacemaker. And then you have here this is based the PQRST interval. You'll see this on an ECG, and you could read through this, but it just talks about the depolarization, the atrial depolarization, PR interval, ventricular depolarization, ventricular repolarization, and ventricular depolarization, repolarization. This is like basically the whole the blood flow through the heart and when the atria and ventricle, the electrical activity going through it. Heart rate regulation. Extrinsic, you have the sympathetic influence, releases catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, leads to tachycardia. So you have epinephrine, which is adrenaline that leads to the fast heart rate. So tachycardia, sympathetic influence. So this is fight or flight. You see something that scares you. It leads to tachycardia, fast heart rate, and that's because of the catecholamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine released. Okay, and then you also have the parasympathetic, which releases acetylcholine, which is the rest and relax response, which leads to bradycardia, slowed heart rate. Heart rate regulation. You have the autonomic nervous system and cardiovascular function. You have sympathetic influence, which is, like I said, increased heart rate, increased myocardial contraction forces, dilate coronary blood vessels, constrict pulmonary vessels, constrict blood vessels in abdomen, skin, kidneys. And then parasympathetic, you have decreased heart rate, decreased myocardial contraction forces, constricted coronary blood vessels, dilated pulmonary vessels, dilated blood vessels in abdomen muscles, skin, and kidneys. So the cortical influence is central command, provides greatest control over the heart rate. This exerts the effect during exercise and at rest. It's and in the immediate exercise period. Okay, pre-exercise period. Produces an anticipatory heart rate, which becomes particularly apparent prior to all out physical effort. And this shows on page 301 what takes place. So you have exercise anticipation from the higher centers, activates sympathetic neurons in the hypothalamus. Okay, here it shows. So the vagal nerve basically is something that gives a parasympathetic response which is, with the acetylcholine to give that rest and relax bradycardia effect, and then sympathetic nerves increase the heart rate, myocardial contractility, and dilate coronary arteries, and that comes from like the adrenaline type of response, and that's why you see that epinephrine there that is released from the adrenal gland. Heart rate regulation, extrinsic. You have peripheral input, which is mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors. So mechanoreceptors are in the muscle when the muscle basically needs to move. That takes place, and it sends signals to then from these mechanoreceptors to the brain. Okay, so then the brain makes a decision. Okay, to move blood in that region. That's a prime example. Chemoreceptors is that okay? There's less blood in this region. There needs to be more blood in this region, based on the lack of oxygen in the blood, let's say. So then there's a decision made to do that by increasing respiration, things like that. So you have heart rate regulation, extrinsic, you have summary of integrated chemical, neural, hormonal adjustments for during exercise. Pre-exercise anticipatory, you have activation of motor cortex, higher areas of the brain, causes increase in sympathetic outflow and reciprocal inhibition of parasympathetic. So you're trying to have that sympathetic response, which is acceleration of heart rate, increased myocardial contractility, vasodilation, skeletal heart muscle, vasoconstriction in other areas, because the blood has to go towards the heart. That's what it's doing. Okay, and then with exercise, you have the continued sympathetic cholinergic outflow, alterations in metabolic conditions due to hypoxia with lack of oxygen. Okay, decreased pH, increase carbon dioxide, increase ADP, increase magnesium, calcium, nitric oxide, temperature. continued sympathetic adrenergic outflow in conjunction with epinephrine and norepinephrine from adrenal medulla. Then response is concomitant constriction of vasculature in inactive tissues to maintain adequate perfusion pressure throughout the arterial system. Venous vessels stiffen to reduce their capacity. Vasoconstriction facilitates venous return and maintains the central blood volume. Arrhythmias are extra beats. Arrhythmias cause they describe heart rhythm irregularities. The extrasystoles or extra beats. You have premature atrial contraction or PAC. Parts of atria become prematurely electrically active, depolarized spontaneously prior to SA node excitation. Linked PACs can create atrial fibrillation. These actually can be caused by psychological stress, anxiety, caffeine consumption can trigger extrasystoles, probably from catecholamines' effect on the rate of change of the SA node's membrane potential. Beta blockers effectively treat this condition, and atrial arrhythmias do not compromise the heart's pumping ability because atrial contraction contributes little to ventricular filling. Premature ventricular contraction, or PVC, premature excitation of ventricles, is ventricular fibrillation, and with this, it's in the most serious cardiac arrhythmia, ventricular fibrillation. The foci of stimuli continually affect different ventricle parts rather than the normal single stimulus from the AV node. Portions of the ventricle contract in an uncoordinated manner with repetitive PVCs, this negating the ventricle's ability to pump blood. Cardiac output and blood pressure decrease. The person rapidly loses consciousness. Resuscitation takes two forms: reestablish normal heart rate, pumping action to restore blood flow and pressure, and halt fibrillation, fibrillation, and reestablish normal electrical rhythms. So the premature ventricular contraction, or PVC, is the one that's the serious one out of the two. All right. Blood distribution during exercise. Increased energy expenditure requires rapid readjustments in blood flow that affect the entire cardiovascular system. Vascular portion of active muscles increases through dilation of local arterioles. At the same time, other vessels constrict to shut down blood flow to the tissues that can temporarily compromise blood supply. So everything basically is going to where the blood's going to where it's needed. Okay, that's basically what that's saying. Blood flow regulation. Flow equals pressure divided by resistance. This is basically this is that flow equals pressure divided by resistance. Okay, three factors determine resistance to blood flow: viscosity or blood thickness, length of conducting tube, radius of blood vessel. Fuseli's law, which is flow equals pressure gradient times vessel radius to the fourth divided by vessel length times fluid viscosity. So reducing vessel's radius by a half decreases flow by a factor of 16. Conversely, doubling the radius increases the volume by 16-fold. Okay, so it means that a relatively small degree of vasoconstriction or vasodilation dramatically impacts regional blood flow. If you constrict the radius, if you reduce the vessel's radius it creates a major issue. Okay. And this happens for a number of reasons. I mean, if like we still talked about, if you have sympathetic response, which is the fight or flight, where really the amygdala in your brain is what is being used, then you have that sympathetic response, which is that vessel that uh, constricts. Okay, stress response, things like that, and then you have the rest and relax, the parasympathetic. It's causing the vessels to expand. Blood flow regulation factors. The local increases in temperature, carbon dioxide, acidity, adenosine, nitric oxide, magnesium, potassium ions, enhance regional blood flow. Neural um, is central vascular control via sympathetic, parasympathetic portions of the autonomic nervous system that overrides the vasoregulation afforded by local factors. So like I said, blood flow regulation, I mean, it can be neural. I mean, there can be a nerve aspect to it. So if you are stressed out, it can cause the sympathetic response, which is the blood flow, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, vasoconstriction. And the same thing with the parasympathetic. I mean, if you have the rest and relax type of response, and which is caused by the physical activity, actually causes aerobic activity causes a parasympathetic response, which is a vasodilator. Okay, so it's interesting, and it also shifts. Studies have shown that the blood flow increases, and you have with the parasympathetic response. So you have exercise that takes place, parasympathetic response takes place, and really what's happening is you're using your prefrontal cortex, which is the CEO of the brain, to think more in a higher degree than the amygdala. So that's why exercise is so beneficial to um, the neural adaptation too as well. Then the mental state is what causes these responses to blood flow and heart rate and all that. So hormonal. With sympathetic activation, adrenal glands release epinephrine, norepinephrine to cause general constrictor response except in blood vessels of the heart and skeletal muscles. Cardiac output, which is the most important indicator of the circulatory system's functional capacity to meet the demands of physical activity. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. And, we have stroke volume, which is the ejection of blood with each stroke. Okay, and then you have heart rate, which is the beats. Okay. One of the other things to think about is that as you do physical activity over time, your stroke volume increases and your heart rate decreases. That's why a lot of people who have exercise heart rate is the average is 70 beats per minute, and then some runners, distance runners, things like that, have around 50 beats per minute. Cardiac output. Where is the blood flow? Well, during physical activity, you have during exercise, you have blood that's flowing to the muscle, okay, 84%, and then at rest, you see there's much different. Okay, you have muscles 20%, liver 27%, okay, brain 14%. Okay. Exercise stroke volume. So physiological mechanisms that increase the heart's stroke volume during exercise. Enhanced cardiac filling and diastole, followed by a more forceful systolic contraction. Neurohormonal influences, which cause normal ventricular filling with subsequent forceful ejection, emptying during systole. Training adaptations can expand blood volume and reduce resistance to blood flow in peripheral tissues. So here you have it shows you have, was it 8, 7? Yeah. This is 8 healthy male subjects and the stroke volume related to increasing exercise intensity, % maximal oxygen uptake. diastolic filling and systolic emptying. You have preload, greater ventricular filling and diastole during the cardiac cycle from an increase in venous return. And then you have resistance to flow from increased systolic pressure, which is the afterload. Okay. So both so the heart's stroke volume increases in physical activity despite resistance to flow, called afterload. Okay. Then the preload, you have an increase in the end systolic volume that stretches myocardial fibers, which causes a powerful ejection stroke of the heart as the heart contracts. And so what happens is you have, in regards to this, there was something called the Frank-Starling law of the heart. It was believed that enhanced venous return activity caused greater cardiac filling, which stretched the ventricles in diastole that produced a more forceful ejection. But actually what they found was that it was not just based upon the stretch in ventricles in diastole to produce more forceful ejection, but also it was also the more complete systolic emptying. Cardiovascular drift, a gradual time-dependent downward drift in several cardiovascular responses, most notably stroke volume with a compensatory heart rate increase during prolonged steady rate exercise. So what happens here is you have during physical activity lasting more than 15 minutes, particularly in the heat, produces progressive water loss through sweating and a fluid shift from the plasma to the tissues. A rising core temperature also causes blood redistribution to the periphery for body cooling. At the same time, the progressive decrease in plasma volume decreases central venous cardiac filling pressure, which reduces stroke volume. A reduced stroke volume initiates a compensatory heart rate increase to maintain a nearly constant cardiac output as activity progresses, and this is cardiac drift. So basically, there's a downward drift in stroke volume with a concomitant heart rate increase during prolonged steady rate activity. One explanation for it is that the stroke volume decline during prolonged activity in a thermo-neutral environment relates to an increased activity heart rate and not increased continuous blood flow. So more than likely, the progressive heart rate increase with cardiovascular drift decreases the end diastolic volume to subsequently reduce the heart's stroke volume. Exercise heart rate. So heart rate increases rapidly and levels off several minutes during submaximal steady rate exercise. Heart rate for the untrained person accelerates rapidly with increasing exercise demands. A much smaller heart rate increase occurs for the trained person. So they achieve a higher level of exercise oxygen uptake at a particular submaximal heart rate than a sedentary person. So when you climb the stairs, if you're untrained, your heart rate goes up quickly. If you are a trained person, it takes longer for your heart rate to rise like that. Cardiac output, oxygen transport. A low aerobic capacity links closely to a low max cardiac output. Makes sense. And an increase in max cardiac output directly improves a person's capacity to circulate oxygen, profoundly impacts the maximal oxygen consumption. That's why it's essential to do aerobic activity, running, jogging, things like that. And for how long, technically, CDC was saying adults 30 minutes a day, but really should be around 60 minutes a day or more of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And 60 minutes a day is only 4% of your day, so it's really not that much. Okay, cardiac output, oxygen transport. This just talks about sedentary versus trained. max cardiac output, max oxygen uptake. Makes sense that trained athletes have a higher max cardiac output and a max oxygen uptake. Cardiac output differences. Cardiac output, oxygen consumption, remain linearly related during great exercise, boys, girls, men, and women. Teenage and adult females exercise at any level of submaximal oxygen consumption with a 5 to 10% larger cardiac output than males. Compared to adults, children have smaller cardiac outputs at any given submaximal exercise oxygen consumption from smaller stroke volumes. Okay. The biological significance of this difference to central circulatory function between children and adults, though, is still somewhat unclear, because stroke volume is a part of it, but it's not everything. AV difference. So this talks about you have the arterial and arterial differences, basically the extraction of oxygen. So what happens here is you have the VO2 max that equals max cardiac output times max AV-O2 difference. The capacity for each deciliter of arterial blood carrying oxygen actually increases during exercise from an increased hemo concentration from the progressive movement of fluid from the plasma to the interstitial space. Diverting a large portion of the cardiac output to active muscles influences the magnitude of the AVO difference in max exercise. An increase in the capillary to fiber ratio reflects a positive training adaptation that enlarges the interface for nutrient and gas exchange during exercise. So if blood flow were the only means to increase the tissue's oxygen supply, cardiac output would need to increase from 5 liters at rest to 100 liters in maximal exertion to achieve 20-fold increase in oxygen uptake that's necessary, okay? Fortunately, intense physical effort doesn't need to require such a large cardiac output because hemoglobin releases extra oxygen from the blood, perfusing active tissues. So the two mechanisms for oxygen supply increase a person's oxygen uptake capacity by increased tissue blood flow and the use of relatively large quantity of oxygen remaining unused by tissues at rest. Okay. So arterial blood oxygen content varies little from its value of 20 milliliters per deciliter at rest throughout the full intensity range. In contrast, venous oxygen varies between 12 and 15 milliliters per deciliter at rest to a low of 2 to 4 milliliters a deciliter to a low of 2 to 4 milliliters per deciliter during maximum physical activity. The difference between arterial and mixed venous blood oxygen content, or an AVO difference, at any time represents the extraction of blood as it circulates through the body's tissues, okay? So that's what AVO difference is. Basically, it represents the oxygen extraction from blood as it circulates through the body's tissues. At rest, for example, the AVO difference equals 5 milliliters of oxygen represents only 25% of the blood's oxygen content. 75% of oxygen bound to hemoglobin returns unused to the heart. Okay, so that's why it has to do with the concentration, okay, of so basically the capacity of each deciliter of arterial blood to carry oxygen actually increases during physical activity. If it didn't increase, going back to talking about the 5 liters per minute going through the body, you would have to have 100 liters at maximum exertion for the 20-fold increased oxygen uptake. It doesn't do that because you have this capacity of each deciliter of arterial blood carrying oxygen increases. So the capacity of arterial blood to carry oxygen increases. That's why the heart, you don't have to circulate that much blood even through increased exercise. And that's what this is talking about here. You have the arterial O2 capacity, and then the arterial O2 content, okay? Blood oxygen content and oxygen consumption, and then the AVO difference, okay? So here you have changes in AVO difference from rest to maximal exercise in physically active men. Cardiovascular adjustments to upper body exercise. The highest oxygen uptake during upper body exercise generally averages between 70 to 80% of VO2 max on the bicycle and treadmill exercise. Maximal heart rate and pulmonary ventilation remains lower on exercise with the arms from a relatively smaller muscle mass. Any level of submaximal power output produces a higher oxygen uptake with arm compared to leg exercise. And that's what this talks about here, where the arm exercise requires greater oxygen uptake than the leg exercise at any submaximal power output throughout the comparison range. Largest difference occurs during intense exertion.